This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
Hello, I'm Matthew Sykes. Today, we're diving into the global forces that shape history, politics, and the future with Professor Joe Siracusa, veteran historian and Curtin's Inaugural Professor of Global Futures in the Faculty of Humanities. Born and raised in Chicago, Professor Siracusa has spent his career examining the global intersection of history, politics, and the future, challenging how we think about time, decision-making, and global challenges. He's written extensively on everything from nuclear weapons to the evolution of human security and global governance. But his focus today is on something even bigger: how we should think about the future, not just as a passive outcome of past events, but as something we can actively shape. So what can history teach us about the future? How do we navigate uncertainty in a world of rapid change? And how can global futures help us turn foresight into actionable insights? Let's find out. Professor Siracusa, the school of thought represented by global futures feels tricky to pin down. There are competing definitions, differences of opinion regarding scope, methods, and provenance. I want to start with your definition of global futures, please.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, in a nutshell, global futures is about the study of anticipating future possibilities, including stories in different scales of time about both likely catastrophes and jump points, creating new horizons of possibility, perhaps even paradigm shifts, co-determining further action. The future in this sense is seen as a product of intended and unintended consequences, the latter I call the iron law of history, if you will, and conditioned circumstances. At the same time, the future turns out, determines in part the meaning of the past.
It's interesting, this iron law idea. Is that drawn from Goethe, is it?
Probably. I mean, it's about how things turn out just the opposite of what you thought they would. For example, the three empires of Europe went to war in 1914, and they all disappeared at the end of it. I mean, what could be truer than that?
Absolutely. No, it's fascinating. So you talk in your definition of global futures about a critical realist ontology. But what precisely do you mean by that?
Before we get to critical realist ontology, first we need to get across the idea that history is not linear. It's not a straight line. The meaning of historical events is not fixed at the moment they happen. It changes depending on how the future unfolds. Social, political, and scientific developments interact in unpredictable ways, creating feedback loops, disruptions, and new possibilities rather than a straightforward progression. And grasping the true significance of any of it might take years to unpack.
Wow. So, okay, if the past itself isn't linear, then why should the future be?
That's correct. The past is only the past if you believe that time is linear, a straight line, if you will. It's not. If you believe the past is cyclical or concurrent, then the past is still occurring or will happen again, whether you observe it or not. I'm reminded of William Faulkner's wonderful line from Requiem of None: "The past is never dead, it's not even past." Similarly, there's nothing remotely linear about the future, the mirror image of the past. The only constant here is human nature, which has not changed in thousands of years. A critical realist ontology, a combination of realism, a school of thought that knows there is a real world independent of our perceptions and critical analysis, which examines the structures and mechanisms that shape events. Ontology is broadly the study of being, though I have to look it up all the time. It helps us explain why there are always multiple possible futures. The real world isn't just made of what actually happens. It also includes possibilities that never come to life and the untapped potential of existing systems and structures that still have an impact. Emergence is also real in that it is always possible that new powers, structures, and mechanisms emerge and existing ones disappear. Critical realism, in essence, a philosophical approach to understanding science, especially social science, is a branch of philosophy that distinguishes between the real world and the observable. The real cannot be observed and exists independent from human perceptions. The world as we know and understand it is constructed from our perspective and experiences through what is observable. Bottom line here is the unobservable structures cause observable events, and the social world can be understood only if people understand the structures that generate events. Put another way, critical realist ontology explains why there are multiple possible futures. Actual is only part of the real world, which also consists of non-actualized possibilities and the unexercised power of the already existing structures and mechanisms that are transfactually effective in open spaces. Emergence is also real. It's possible that new powers, structures, and mechanisms emerge, and existing ones may disappear.
Sorry to cut you off, Joe. fascinating simply because I think they're immediately about the work of Jacques Derrida. I think about Mark Fisher, and I think about the idea of hauntology, and this idea that there are echoes of the past that we find in the future, and those echoes are the way things could have gone. Is that what Global Futures is looking for? That sort of sense of how things could be different or should be different?
It's about how things will be different. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's about all those things. And we get this sense or this hauntiness about we're looking at the future, but we can't quite see it. Global Futures looks at sort of frameworks about how we can determine what the future might be. But you're quite right. It's in philosophy, it's in science fiction, it's in the Bible, it's in the Talmud, it's everywhere.
Yeah, of course.
You know, it ain't what you see exactly.
Yeah.
Something's coming, something's quite different.
I think it starts with the, well, for me at least, eschatology, you know, that idea of the study of the end, which is sort of a close cousin, I guess, of Global Futures.
Critical realist ontology has deep roots and great parentage, goes way, way back. As long as people think about the universe. And of course, we don't teach philosophy or even history in universities anymore. I don't know what we do. We lost all these things in the last 30 years due to cuts and things like that. So this is sort of putting people back on the rails again.
And you talked there about science fiction. I think that, you know, for me, speculative fiction certainly is such a, well, I think of it as a kind of torch that sometimes lights up the dark. You've mentioned science fiction. Do you think about any specific science fiction authors or what kind of role they play?
I'm thinking of Arthur Clarke and H.G. Wells, the great 19th and 20th century writer. I'm thinking here Azoff and these people who just even Bradbury, people like that. They just think about the future. You know, what I get a kick out of is that people will queue up around a theater in the middle of winter to see a great science fiction movie or a great historical saga. They're not going to line up for anything else, as a matter of fact. And people are kind of driven by that. I think it's kind of latent in our minds that there are different possibilities out there. And I think in recent years, I mean, many people saw Sliding Doors and all the possibilities. That is an incredibly clever movie.
Yeah, right.
And about how things changed. And, you know, of course, we have the great poem about for the lack of a nail, a shoe was lost, and the horse was lost, and the battle was lost, and all the rest of it. That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens all the time.
Is that a quote from Gwyneth Paltrow, or what's it?
I don't think so. But you know, the meaning of the past ultimately depends on how the future turns out. Now, scientists talk the language of possibilities and probabilities. Nonetheless, they can also forecast many practically important things, even if only with imperfect accuracy, within the confines of categories of significance to us in limited space-times. In some other sciences, predictions can be fairly accurate for a long time, while similar considerations apply in social sciences as well. The temporality of the human condition, how it is that time shapes its human experience, opens a series of concerns pertaining to ethics, politics, and the relativity of historical times. Global Futures, then, is a study of that reflexive problematic in the context of the planetary problems of the 21st century. It isn't just about predicting trends. It's an acknowledgement of our need to constantly reevaluate how our current actions shape future possibilities. In turn, how these futures reshape our understanding of the past and the future. To this end, Global Futures integrates natural sciences, philosophy, and social sciences in a novel and innovative way by stepping into the terrain of natural sciences, but from a critical, philosophical, and social scientific point of view. Simultaneously, it develops sensibilities in social and political theory by taking discussions about the temporality of the human condition further than most existing courses.
So you just said there, Joe, that all actors are necessarily lay historians, which I take to mean that we're all in the process of our day-to-day lives interpreting the past, and, you know, for so many different reasons. Do you see it as the role of Global Futures to, I don't know, bring together that knowledge of everyday historians and bring that together in some way?
Yes, it's the imperative of universities to integrate the role of Global Futures into the curriculum, both systematizing the formal study and principles of Global Futures while raising awareness. As president of the Australian Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, I lobbied at length for the government appointment of a chief social scientist, alongside the chief scientist, to scrutinize the socially and politically significant implications of long-term physical, ecological, and economic trends and their underlying mechanisms and processes. Scenario construction that follows can be seen as a self-reflexive exercise in cultural studies, moral philosophy, and creative ability in the same way that research and development or the arts are creative. From a Wellesian point of view, it can even be argued that unless we destroy ourselves at this critical self-made moment of history, the cosmic setting of the drama playing out on Earth and increasingly elsewhere in the solar system and beyond, humans still have time to think the great thoughts, create magnificent projects, and open up extraordinary possibilities. Urban planners will be asked to revisualize cities as climate change does its worst and globalization 2.0 takes off. Intellectuals and social engineers will be busy reimagining what people think and think about. New universities are cropping up in Africa and Asia to enable people to compete on the global stage, that kind of thing. Arguably, the Global Futures Adventures is part of the cosmic evolution. It's about the process of the cosmos becoming conscious of itself. The future is relatively open, and the meaning of the past is not fully determined either. What could possibly go wrong? Global Futures knows that often the best people placed to see what's coming down the track are people who are making the present. Policymakers know that conflict is inherently inappropriate or looking to formulate grand strategy on the big systemic issues, which are planetary. Scientists know what doesn't work anymore. Farmers know what's happening in their yields. Teachers know what their students are thinking. The remit of our studies is in part to piece together those fragments of the future so that we can be prepared for what's coming next. It's in this sense that our studies complement every discipline within the academy, producing actionable information.
Fantastic. Yeah, so that concept of actionable information, can we perhaps unpack that a little bit? Any examples that you've got to share?
Okay, well, we need people who can see beyond the horizon, which is 7 miles, by the way. And we have to know that the horizon is always changing. Global Futures encourages that sort of medium to long-term thinking, helping us to arrive at actionable information, really intelligence we can know that can nudge us towards the places we want to go in the future. As a young historian attending a conference in New York, I had the privilege of meeting Thomas Kuhn, an American historian and philosopher whose book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, took the Academy by storm. In a scientific revolution, Kuhn observed, the current scientific paradigm is replaced by a new one that offers a different conceptual model of how nature functions. At some point, scientists can't proceed with business as usual. This is where Newton had to yield to Einstein, forcing to look for new ways to interpret the data. The Global Futures insight, with its enormous yet elegant message, deeply affected the academy, scientific, and business worlds. It's ultimately an empowering mission. Since the future isn't set, Global Future pushes us to think about the kind of future we want and what actions are needed to achieve it. It isn't just predicting what happened. You can flip a coin for that. Global Futures helps create frameworks for making better decisions today based on possible futures.
Yeah, look, that feels quite optimistic to me, really quite pleasingly optimistic. And, I'm brought to mind, and apologies, I'm a bleeding heart cultural studies student, but it brings to mind Foucault and what we could learn from Foucault in terms of thinking about the genealogy of knowledge, epistemes. Do you see any sort of role for that kind of thinking within Global Futures?
Yeah, Global Futures, people started when Thomas Kuhn was thinking about paradigm shifts. It's about the same time that Foucault's writing books and people are reading his work and taking him very serious at universities. And the idea of being interested in knowledge and how knowledge is shaped, how it shapes our institutions, and how we in turn, punch our tickets to continue to do these things. And then we get into a world where things don't work. If you try to go through a wall 6 times, you're going to think about going through the wall the 7th time. It just doesn't work. and what Foucault did was, as well as Sartre and that entire, I grew up in the 60s reading those people, and the science fiction and the rest of it, is they challenge you to think new ways. But the new ways they're thinking are really old ways. They're 17th, 18th century. They are about the zeitgeist. They are about the climate of opinion. You use a certain way of doing things. They say that people, governments plan, departments of war, ministries of war, always plan for the last war. It's kind of what we're talking about here, how you can see the future. When I was a kid, I heard stories about a very brave young sailor named Billy Mitchell, who argued that the day of the great warships was over. The aircraft carrier was going to wipe him off the sea. And he was absolutely right. He got court-martialed for his insubordination, by the way. He had this vision that nations like Japan could just go to the sea and take care of the aircraft carriers without even seeing them by using the planes on the top of their ships. So, people can see these things. But when you can't explain what's going on, and my great concern is unless we take this on seriously, and when Curtin started developing global futures, I thought, oh, this is pretty good because it matches my own background in history of the future. That it's important work because people who get it wrong, and people get things wrong all the time, they tend to double down on what they did wrong, even if it costs people their lives and costs a lot of money. And we don't have all the time in the world. We got some time, but we don't have all the time in the world. And when I hear that the Japanese and the Indians and others are making soft landings on the moon, you can think they're thinking about their future and see what's going to work. I mean, you wonder what the hell they're doing about putting these soft landings. I know what they're doing. They're planning for the next world. And I tell you what, we're going to miss the opportunity unless we start to think like they do. And this kind of thinking obtains right across the world.
That's because when I think about Foucault certainly, and to some extent Thomas Kuhn as well, I think about trying to sketch what is knowable, trying to understand what is knowable within any kind of regime of knowledge, and then trying to go beyond that. And I think that's, for me, it looks like what the mission of Global Futures is to try and get through that kind of boundary of the knowable and
I
into
mentioned
the unknowable.
new universities. There's Vinh University in Hanoi, and there's a new liberal arts university, 20 years old, in Morocco. And they both have Foucault and others on the reading list.
Wow.
And they understand that they're going to miss out on something if they don't look at what these people are saying. And I think these new universities, it's just it's a breath of fresh air. They're not going back to the old things in a sense of 19th century. They're going back to those things that caused people to think. The 60s was a very special time. It produced a lot of people around the world who were that new generation. They were trying to get their heads out of the sand and think about everything. And so they did what? They turned to philosophy. They turned to moral politics. They turned to action. Maybe the French should have read a little more instead of throwing rocks at the police in the 1960s. But
I think you could argue that's because they read so much that they threw rocks at the police.
That's exactly right.
Well, look, I love this idea that the study of global futures will empower students and researchers themselves as well to create magnificent projects that open up extraordinary possibilities. Certainly sounds exciting, Joe. So do you have any current example of what that might look like in practice?
Well, I mentioned these universities,
Yep.
but here at Curtin, I'm a humanities consultant over at St. Cat's, and we have a student there who's just won a Fulbright. Now, a lot of my students have won Fulbrights over the years, about 6 of them. And he's going to America to study engineering and its policy implications for future planning. So he's combined these two fields by hanging out with people like me. And he likes the future and he likes science. And so he's going to combine the two of them together. I think this is a great example of what we can do. Also, I hang out with a lot of the urban planners on this campus, and they've got some wonderful ideas. And, every time there's an Olympics and they knock something down, they build something really quite beautiful in its place that could become low-cost housing later on. It's no accident that a lot of the brightest people in universities today are in architecture departments, urban planning departments. They have a very fresh view of what the world looks like and should look like. In the past, when I started university, all your vice chancellors and presidents of university were physicists because they looked like they had what? They had captured the sun, the power of the sun, through nuclear weapons and nuclear energy and that kind of thing. And then we moved on to other things. And today, I think a lot of the best planning in the humanities is that kind of urban planning. It's got a lot of bright thinkers, people who think broadly. The thing is that they don't have the opportunity. I was asked the other day if I would go into one of the urban planning classes this semester for a couple lectures and talk about how global futures pertains to their work for their students. So what we don't have yet, we get a lot of people talk about global futures. That's just future with a plural, with an S, is we don't have a systematic way of looking at what we're doing. We all know how to get there, but we're not quite sure what it means yet. So, we're all sort of intuitive. And the nice thing about philosophy is it's intuitive. It's in everybody's head. And all you got to do is just drag it out of it.
Well, that's fascinating. Look, I want to ask you specifically about the current context and specifically about those two letters that I think are on everyone's lips at some point, AI. So what can we learn, in your view, Joe, perhaps, from past similar moments of technological upheaval? Something that may offer us portents of how this whole thing around AI might play out.
Yeah, well, AI had the same, I think, has the same kind of future as the internet. You know, it looks like it's going to take everything by storm. It looks like a sort of a substitute for thinking, the way the internet does. You know, the internet has taught an entire generation of people how to become illiterate by just mastering the mechanics of the internet. They're not unintelligent. They're just arriving at knowledge in a very different way.
Sure.
You know, they don't have to look at something for years and years. They kind of piece things. And AI is the same thing. And I mean, they say that AI will make ethical choices in warfare and that kind of thing. I believe that as long as we understand global futures, is that we can control the future and the technology that powers it. These are ancillary. These are our friends. They're going to do exactly what we tell them to do, or we're going to take the plug out of the wall, okay? They don't exist without us. These people who say that AI and the internet, they've overpowered us, not quite yet. We're still in charge. And what Global Futures does, and I think you've hit on the word, it empowers us to be part of these frameworks that decides that AI will play this role or won't play that role. But it's never going to replace ethics, moral philosophy, or human choice. I don't care what you say about these things. They may become killing machines and the rest of it. But I think AI is important. You know, if it can look at millions of pieces of knowledge and give you 10 sentences about something you're in a hurry for. The trouble is it doesn't tell you how you arrived at it. And it seems to me that with Global Futures, it puts thinking back into university life. You know, it isn't just some wall chart or PowerPoints. You know, it teaches people how to think about the future in terms of frameworks and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Look, and I think I wonder if you're excited about AI from the perspective of how much it will help with things like interpolative reasoning, you know, having a look within data sets and finding perhaps some, well, if not conclusions, but clues about what's coming next.
I've just written a very important book about the lessons of the First World War. It's called Revisiting the First World War. It's going to be put out by Exeter University Press. And I wrote it with one of my former students. And so we have about 8 chapters. And as an exercise the other day, we just asked AI to name the chapters after looking at them. And it had 8 brilliant names. You know, I'm pretty good at chapter headings and chapter titles and titles of books. And I thought, it's like someone in the room with you, you know? He had this intimate knowledge of what was going on in the chapters, had perfectly framed. And while it was pitch perfect, the titles, there was something surrealistic about it. You know, a machine could arrive at those titles. But, you know, you still got to ask human beings to read it. There is no replacing human play. Arthur Clarke makes it very clear, and Wells and everybody else. You can't replace human beings. Choice. And it is our choice to use these things properly. I mean, we could screw up. We could have bad people in charge of these things. We could have drones over Washington or London tomorrow. We've all seen the movies, you know, London's down, Washington's down with drones and all the rest of it. But I think ultimately we have choices. And I think things like Global Future, which connect us to philosophy and the past philosophers, empowers us to have some confidence in what we're doing. Otherwise, we're just buffeted by the winds, you know, and you know, Donald Trump said the other day that he's got common sense. Well, I don't know about that, but you know, the one thing I know about common sense is it's not very common, and common sense comes from reading, writing, thinking, and living a life. And I think Global Futures gives us that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Joe, your life and your career have taken you right across the world, putting you in front of some of the most important names in 20th and 21st century history. What lessons, either drawn from the lives of those you met or from your own experience, would you want to give a student of Global Futures?
Well, I was lucky. I was born and raised in Chicago. I went out west to Colorado on the eastern slope of the Rockies. I studied in Boulder and Denver and And I went to Vienna for a couple of years, and I met all the great intellectuals in the world who were on the circuit. And before the internet, people like Arnold Toynbee, Hans Kohn, the father of nationalism, and Karl Popper, and Martin Luther King, and everybody else who was doing anything, they'd go to universities. And they'd go to universities to talk to students, to tell them what they were doing. They didn't try to recruit people, or they would just get confirmation about what they were doing, etc. And so all these brilliant people used to come to us. I mean, today, these people would never come to you. You'd have to go through their agents to even get a look at them. But back before the internet, this is what people had to do. They trusted universities, and universities trusted them. And I got to see a great number of men and women who thought for a living. And I was always struck by their extraordinary ability to be understood. They never used big words. They understood what any university student or senior student in high school could. So they were very eloquent, and they're great theories, whether it was Karl Popper in the history, the poverty of historicism, or whatever it is, or Toynbee challenging. It's always very simple things to understand. They didn't have a big message. They had an elegant message, which then had a big framework. They weren't trying to bowl you over, kind of thing.
I wonder, actually, can you tell me a little bit more about meeting Martin Luther King?
Well, it was April 1967. I was a graduate student at the University of Denver in Colorado. I was in the Joseph Corbell School of Graduate Studies. He was Madeleine Albright's father. I didn't know that at the time, though. And King came in. He'd just given a talk at Riverside Church in New York, where he talked about the Vietnam War had superseded the concerns of the civil rights movement. He argued that it was impossible to move forward civil rights unless we ended the violence in Vietnam. And of course, the violence in Vietnam gave the Black Panthers and the Black Power people ammunition over him, because he said, how could you ask them to put down their guns when America tries to do everything at the end of a gun, kind of thing. And so he was sort of depressed. And he began with Victor Hugo. He says to us, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And that was civil rights. But he didn't realize that the Vietnam War was going to come. That was completely unanticipated as far as he was concerned. And since most of the recruits, 19% of the recruits who were drafted into the armed forces were black kids, and they were sent to Vietnam, and they wound up in the grinder. They were the disproportionate number of people killed, along with brown people and white people from Appalachia. We had 27 million men of draft age in those days, and those who couldn't think of a university to go to or get into, or couldn't think of some profession to get into, or didn't join the Marines or the Air Force, got drafted. And when you got drafted, you were sent to Vietnam into the machine. And that machine killed 59,000 of my colleagues, wounded 300,000, and killed 2 million. They watched 2 million Vietnamese killed at the same time. People always say to me, gee, when did these mass killings that happen in America, when did they start? They started in the 60s when a young man climbed the tower at Texas, a Vietnam veteran, and opened fire on kids and men and women on the campus. And it all began in 1966 because Americans are watching the war on television in real time, and they're watching people blown up. They're watching Americans incinerate forests and all the rest of it. It was a very violent time. And so King says that we can't move forward unless we get rid of this. And of course, he became an arch enemy of Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson started having him followed and discovering all his secrets. Everybody has secrets. And they made his life miserable for him. He was murdered a year later. But when he came to that classroom, and we were all expecting to hear how the civil rights movement would play out in legislation, and he said he'd given up. Here's a Nobel laureate in civil rights who'd given up because the war in Vietnam had overtaken how Americans think about the world. And so it told me what the future would be. The future would be the post-Vietnam world, and civil rights would have to fit in later on. And it did, as a matter of fact. So that's the kind of opportunities we had at university that people don't have today.
And so is that, I suppose the lesson from that is that something about if the moment for your idea hasn't yet arrived, that patience is somehow morally part of global futures?
Yeah, I mean, moral futures includes ethics, moral philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even thinking a little more about the future than you want to. That's right. Maybe your idea has not come, or maybe your idea has come and it got trashed along the way, or it got caught up with something else.
Sure.
You know, a lot of good people get caught between the cracks,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And he taught us that no matter how powerful you were, that if you thought about the future long enough, you might even realize that it's not your future. It's somebody else's future. But he could see that the world was turning on a dime when we didn't see it. You know, we were just sort of into the social movement, activism kind of thing. And he realized unless you solve one problem, you can't solve the next three. And that was all kind of new thinking for me because I was linear.
Mm.
You know, I thought the future had a straight line. Well, with people like King and with the, you know, what we learned from people like Popper and Hans Kohn and others is that the future is not linear, nor is the past. So it's kind of like, you know, as Hemingway says, a movable feast.
Well, that's it. And it calls to mind for me as well one of my favourite quotes by a science fiction author, one who I believe ran away from the draft up to Canada, William Gibson. And he said that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed.
That's exactly right. That's in fact, I think that line was quoted once in the Rocky Mountain News when it was a terrible newspaper in Denver. I think I saw it there for the first time. Yeah, that's exactly right. The future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. That's exactly correct. But anyway, I think this university's decision to move along this road of global future is a great idea. I'm not sure that we have in place a systematic way of thinking about what we're talking about. You know, people are just sort of imagine what they're doing. But it isn't just about the future of. It's the futures of. You know, the many possibilities and how we are in control of these things. And frankly, without thinking, I always said to students for the past 50 years, if you don't think about your history, you're not going to have any. And I'll say the same thing today. If you don't think about your future, you're not going to have one.
Beautiful. Professor Siracusa, thank you so much for joining us today. That was fascinating insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe to The Future Of on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.